The notice had been folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, like cloth, like something that had been handled the way people handled things they couldn't stop thinking about. Nora Callahan had pulled it from the county website at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, printed it on the library's machine for 8 cents because her own printer had run out of ink sometime in October, and she hadn't replaced it, and she'd been folding and unfolding it for 6 days since. She kept it in the front pocket of her jeans. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't as though the words were going to change. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Lot 114, Pratt County Tax Auction, 0.87 acres, unincorporated township, rural Route 9. Improvements: 1 sealed concrete structure, former government designation, condition unknown. Minimum bid, $400, sold strictly as is. Her sister Diane had read it over her shoulder the first time and laughed the way Diane laughed at things she found genuinely stupid. Not mean exactly, just the laugh of someone who had a mortgage and a husband and a functional printer and couldn't quite imagine the mental state that would lead a person to look at the word sealed concrete structure, condition unknown, and feel something other than immediate disinterest. It's a bunker, Nora. I know what it is. You know what I mean. It's just a bunker. There's nothing there. There's no house. There's no land you can farm. It's less than an acre of scrub grass with a sealed concrete box sitting in the middle of it. The county's been trying to offload it for 11 years. I know that too. So, what are you thinking? Nora hadn't been able to answer that. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer sounded ridiculous even inside her own head, and she knew how it would land coming out of her mouth into Diane's kitchen, under Diane's recessed lighting, while Diane's husband watched football in the next room, and their kids slept upstairs in their own beds in their own house. She was thinking that she had $412 in her checking account. She was thinking that Emma's school had sent home a note about a field trip that cost $35. She was thinking that if she didn't find something, some way, some handhold on anything solid, she was going to have to ask Diane if they could keep staying in the spare room. And Diane would say yes because Diane was her sister. And that yes would cost more than any dollar amount Nora could calculate. She was thinking that a sealed concrete box sitting on less than an acre of Kansas scrubland was the only thing in the Pratt County tax auction she could actually afford to bid on. She had not said any of that. She'd folded the paper, put it back in her pocket, and said she was going to get Emma ready for bed. That had been 6 days ago. The auction was tomorrow morning. She lay on the narrow guest bed in Diane's spare room and listened to her daughter breathe in the twin bed 3 feet away. Emma slept the way children slept when they were exhausted from something they didn't fully understand, deeply, absolutely, with one hand curled under her cheek and the other arm hanging off the edge of the mattress. 9 years old. She'd started a new school in September when they moved into Diane's house, and she hadn't complained once, not once. She'd packed her own backpack the first morning, made her own lunch because Nora had been on the phone with the bank, and walked to the car with her chin up in that way she had, that deliberate, quiet dignity that sometimes made Nora feel she'd done something right and sometimes made her feel like she'd failed completely. The divorce had been final in March. It hadn't been dramatic. There was no single catastrophic event, no affair, no screaming. Just the slow accumulation of 2 people who had needed different things from each other and had each become someone the other one didn't recognize. One morning, Tom had sat down at the kitchen table and said he thought they should talk. And they had talked. What followed was paperwork and logistics, and the particular grief of ending something that had once been the center of your life, without any clear villain to blame for its ending. The house had been sold in May. The equity after the mortgage paid off what the lawyers had cost, which was most of it. Nora had taken Emma and 3 carloads of their things to Diane's spare room, and told herself it was temporary. September came, then October. The job at the county records office had been part-time to begin with, and when the county cut the budget in August, it became less than part-time, which was a bureaucratic way of saying it became nothing. She was 34 years old. She had a daughter who packed her own lunch without being asked, and a sister who said yes when she needed to, and $412 and a folded piece of paper with a lot number on it. She fell asleep sometime after midnight. The auction was held in the basement of the county courthouse, a room with fluorescent lights and plastic folding chairs, and a smell that was half old carpet and half the particular mustiness of places where bureaucracy accumulated over decades. Nora arrived at 8:15 with Emma, who had a book in her backpack and instructions to read quietly if things got boring. Things were mostly boring. The auctioneer, a compact man named Garrett with a voice better suited to a much larger space, moved through the lots at a pace that suggested he had somewhere else to be. Residential parcels went first, then commercial, then the miscellaneous category that held things the county had been sitting on because nobody quite knew what to do with them. Lot 114 came up at 9:47. Garrett read the listing without embellishment. Sealed concrete structure, former government designation, condition unknown, minimum bid $400. He looked out at the 20 or so people in the room. Nobody moved. Nora raised her hand. Garrett looked at her the way people looked when the only bidder was someone they hadn't expected to bid. $400. Do I have $450? The room was quiet. $400 going once, going twice. He brought the gavel down. Sold. Emma looked up from her book. Did we get something? We got something. What did we get? Nora folded the auction receipt and put it in her pocket alongside the lot notice. I'll show you. The drive out rural Route 9 took 20 minutes from the courthouse, past the grain elevator on the edge of town, and then past the point where the town stopped pretending to be a town and became what it actually was, which was flat land and sky, and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with a windbreak of cottonwoods that had been planted by someone's grandparents. The GPS took them down a gravel road that Nora had driven once before, the week after she'd printed the lot notice, just to look. She'd sat in her car at the end of the driveway and looked at the property through the windshield, and then driven home and not told anyone she'd done that. The property was not impressive. This was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about it. The parcel was roughly rectangular, fenced with rusted barbed wire that sagged between wooden posts gone gray with age. And inside the fence, the land was mostly yellowed grass and thistle, and a few cottonwood saplings that had come up along what might have been a drainage channel at some point. The driveway was 2 ruts in the grass leading from the road to a gravel apron, and at the end of the gravel apron sat the structure. Calling it a bunker made it sound more dramatic than it looked. It was a rectangle of poured concrete rising about 4 feet above the ground, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a flat roof that had accumulated decades of dirt and dead vegetation to the point where it looked almost like a low earthen mound from a distance. Exterior walls were gray-brown, water-stained, cracked in places by frost heave and time. There were no windows. There was no visible door, which was what had made it sealed concrete structure, rather than just abandoned building in the county's listing language. Emma got out of the car and stood looking at it with her hands in her coat pockets. "Big gray box," she said. "It is. Is it ours?" Nora had the receipt in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at it again, the way she'd been looking at the lot notice for 6 days. Been 14. Sold, yeah. It's ours. Emma walked toward it slowly, the way she approached most things, with a careful curiosity that assessed before it committed. She circled the near end, trailing her fingers along the concrete, and stopped at a point on the south wall where something had been mounted and then removed, leaving behind a rectangular shadow of cleaner concrete and 4 bolt holes. Touched the bolt holes. Something was here. Nora came around to look. Clean rectangle was roughly the size of a license plate, a sign. Something that had identified the structure to whatever organization had operated it. Sign, probably. What kind of sign? I don't know yet. They walked the perimeter together. Concrete was solid throughout. Nora had brought a flashlight, a crowbar from Diane's garage that she'd taken without asking, because she hadn't wanted to answer questions, and a thermos of coffee that was already mostly gone. On the north wall, low, near the ground, she found the seam. It was barely visible, filled with what looked like rubberized sealant that had gone brittle and cracked with age, a rectangular outline roughly 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, set into the wall. The door had been sealed from the outside, welded probably, before the sealant was applied. Nora crouched down and pressed her palm against the concrete just below the seam. It felt cold through her skin. She kept her hand there. Emma crouched beside her. This how we get in? Probably. How do we get it open? Not today. Emma considered this. She was not a child who pushed against the word not today. She accepted it as information about timing rather than permanence, which was a form of patience. Nora was fairly certain she hadn't taught her. Okay, Emma said, but we're coming back? We're coming back. They drove back to Diane's house. Diane was in the kitchen making lunch, and she looked at Nora's face when she came through the door and said, "You actually did it." "I did. You spent $400 on a sealed concrete box." "I own a sealed concrete box." Diane was quiet for a moment. She had the ability to make silence feel like a specific kind of sentence, which was something Nora had been navigating since childhood. What are you going to do with it?" "Open it." "And then what?" Nora poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter and looked at her sister. Diane wasn't being cruel. Diane had driven her to the hospital when Emma was born because Tom was stuck on a job site in Wichita, and she'd sat in the waiting room for 6 hours without complaint and brought balloons after, and cried at the sight of Emma in the way people cried when they understood that something mattered. She was asking because she was worried, not because she wanted to win an argument. "Don't know yet," Nora said honestly. "But I had to do something." Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she put a sandwich on the counter beside Nora's elbow and went back to the stove without saying anything else, which was its own kind of kindness. That night, after Emma was asleep, Nora sat at Diane's kitchen table with her laptop and what was left of her patience and started to research. She went in without much of a framework. Sealed bunker, Kansas. Cold War military installations, Pratt County. Government surplus property, decommissioned 1970s. She followed threads the way she had learned to follow them during her years at the records office, which was to say patiently, without assuming that the useful information would announce itself. Most of what she found was general. There had been hundreds of classified installations built across the Great Plains during the 1950s and 1960s. Some of them missile silos, some of them communications relays, some of them facilities whose purpose was never publicly documented and remained unacknowledged in any record she could find. She found a FOIA database maintained by a historian in Topeka who had spent 15 years cataloging decommissioned federal facilities in Kansas and Nebraska. She searched by county. Pratt County yielded 3 entries. 2 were Nike missile batteries, both fully documented and long since converted or demolished. 3rd was listed under a designation she didn't recognize. Installation KS7714. Classification: Crypto Black, decommissioned, October 1973. Official status: records transferred to secure archive. Current physical status: sealed. That was the entire entry. No description of the installation's function. No record of transfer to county jurisdiction. No documentation of what had happened to whatever was inside it when it was sealed in October of 1973. She stared at the words Crypto Black for a long time. She didn't sleep well. She was up by 5:30 and she drove to the county courthouse before it opened and waited in the parking lot until the records office unlocked at 8. And she spent 2 hours going through the chain of title on lot 1114, going back as far as the paper records went. The parcel had passed to county jurisdiction in 1988 through a tax delinquency process that referenced a federal agency she didn't recognize, whose acronym didn't appear in any directory she could find. Before that, the trail went into a gap in the records that the clerk at the desk, a woman named Ruth, who had worked in that office for 26 years, described as not unusual for federal properties that were relinquished without standard documentation. Sometimes just stopped paying taxes, Ruth said, not critically, the way she said most things. Federal agency property would sit on the books as a delinquency for years before the county took it. We've got 3 or 4 parcels like that, going back to different eras. Most of them don't have anything on them anymore. Most of them, Nora said. Ruth looked at her. You bought the bunker parcel. Yesterday. Ruth appeared to consider several things at once. I've been here since this property was on our books. Nobody's ever tried to open it. We had an engineer out there in 2009 to look at the structure for liability purposes. He said the concrete was sound. He couldn't determine what was inside. Recommendation was to leave it sealed and reassess in 10 years, which is county shorthand for not our problem. Did he say why it was sealed the way it was? Welded door with rubberized sealant applied over the seam. He said it was consistent with government preservation protocol from the early 1970s. Like they were keeping something dry. Nora drove back to rural Route 9 that afternoon with Emma, who had been told where they were going and had arrived at the car with her backpack already on, which was how Emma indicated she was ready and not going to be left behind. She had also, without being asked, pulled Diane's crowbar out of the garage and put it in the back seat. I saw you take it yesterday, Emma said when Nora looked at her. Good thinking. What else do we need? Nora had stopped at the hardware store on the way. She had bought an angle grinder with a metal cutting disc, a heavy hammer, a cold chisel, a box of latex gloves, 2 dust masks, and a set of LED work lights that ran off a portable battery pack. She had spent $63. She had $349 left in her account, which she was not thinking about. The afternoon was cold and clear. The sky the particular hard blue that settled over Kansas in November, and when they got out of the car, the wind came across the grass without obstruction and pushed against them with the flat indifference of open country. Emma pulled her hood up. Nora plugged in the angle grinder and set the work light up on its tripod aimed at the north wall seam. The sealant took 20 minutes to chisel clear. It had gone brittle enough that it broke away in chunks, the rubberized compound crumbling under the cold chisel. And underneath it the weld seam was visible, a continuous bead of steel running the full perimeter of the door outline. The weld was old but competent. Whoever had sealed this door had intended it to stay sealed. Nora had never operated an angle grinder before. She had watched 3 videos on her phone in the hardware store parking lot, put on the safety glasses and the dust mask, and held the grinder against the lower corner of the weld seam and pulled the trigger, and the machine jumped in her hands with a Reek of metal, and a spray of orange sparks that arced across the concrete and died in the gravel. Emma stood back at a respectful distance with her hands in her pockets, watching. It took an hour and 40 minutes to cut the weld seam. The grinder went through 2 cutting discs, and Nora's arms ached from holding the tool steady against the resistance of the steel. Sparks scattered across her jacket, and she stopped twice to drink water and flex her hands. Emma didn't say anything during this time. She watched and occasionally handed Nora things, and once, when the second cutting disc gave out, and Nora stood with the grinder at her side, breathing hard and staring at the half-completed seam, Emma said quietly, "You're more than halfway." The last section of weld gave way at 4:17, with the November light already going gold and low. Nora set the grinder down and picked up the heavy hammer and struck the door at the top corner and then again at the bottom, and then, with the crowbar, inserted the tapered end into the seam and pushed. Door moved, not much. A millimeter, maybe 2, the sealant residue and 51 years of compaction resisting. She repositioned the crowbar and pushed again, putting her weight behind it, and the door scraped inward on concrete with a sound like something fundamental giving way, a slow groan of metal and grit that carried across the empty field and dissolved into the wind. Cold air came out of the gap. Old air, the specific stillness of sealed spaces, without the smell of rot or must, but with something else, something mineral and dry that she couldn't name immediately. The smell of nothing having happened in a very long time. She pushed the door further, and it swung inward on hinges that shrieked with rust and then held. The opening was 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, and the darkness beyond it was complete, pressing back against the late afternoon light like a physical thing. Emma appeared at her shoulder. "We have the lights," she said. Nora set the work light on its tripod inside the threshold and switched it on. Beam opened across a concrete floor, hit the opposite wall, and filled the space with harsh white light that threw hard shadows. What she saw made her stand still for the length of 3 full breaths. The interior was a single room, roughly the dimensions she had estimated from outside. 40 feet deep, 20 feet wide, with a ceiling of maybe 9 feet. The floor was dry concrete, clean, without the damp staining or debris she had expected from a structure sealed for 5 decades. Steel shelving units lined both walls from floor to ceiling, bolted to the concrete, and on the shelves, row upon row, stacked and organized with the systematic precision of people who had expected to return, were wooden crates, metal containers, sealed cases with stenciled lettering, equipment secured with nylon strapping, and at the far end of the room, behind a secondary steel barrier that reached halfway to the ceiling, the outlines of something larger that the work light could not fully illuminate from the threshold. Stenciling on the nearest crate was military format block letters, black on olive drab, U.S., Government, Property of Defense Reserve Authority, classified. The stenciling on the container beside it read the same, and the one beside that, and as Nora swept the work light slowly across the shelving, it became clear that every single item in this room carried the same classification stamp, row after row of sealed government property that had been placed here in 1973 and never retrieved. She stepped inside. The concrete was solid under her feet. The air tasted of nothing. The silence was the deepest kind. The silence of sealed spaces where sound had nowhere to go and nothing to disturb it for 50 years. Emma stepped in behind her and stood at her side, and they both looked at the room, at the crates, the shelves that ran the full length of both walls, floor to ceiling, packed with government property whose contents they could not yet see, but whose presence was already reshaping every assumption Nora had made about what she had purchased for $400. "Mom," Emma said. Her voice was this voice of a child who had learned to be careful with what she wanted, who had spent months understanding that things could be taken away, who had packed her own lunch on the first day of school and not complained and held her own quiet dignity through months of difficulty in a way that had sometimes made her mother's chest ache with love and guilt in equal measure. Mom, what is all this? Nora stood at the center of the room with the work light, throwing her shadow up the far wall, and 50 years of sealed government property surrounding her on both sides, and she did not have the answer yet. But she could feel the answer the way she had sometimes felt approaching weather before the sky showed it. Something large and real and consequential moving toward them across an open field. I don't know yet, she said, which was true. She walked to the nearest shelf and examined the nearest crate without touching it. The wood was dry and solid, the stenciling sharp and legible. Beside the classification stamp, a secondary marking in smaller letters. Reserve asset. Code DIRE Alpha 7. Secure until directive. Below that, a date, September 1973. She moved to the next crate. Same classification, same reserve asset designation, different code. DIRE Alpha 8, then DIRE Alpha 9, a sequence. She walked along the shelf counting, and when she reached the end of the first shelf unit, she turned and looked at the second wall and counted those crates, too. And the numbers ran to places she did not want to say aloud yet, because she had not opened anything, could not confirm anything, and had learned from her years in the records office that the most dangerous thing you could do with incomplete documentation was assume. But she stood there in the cold, clean air of this sealed room in rural Kansas, and she understood that what she was looking at was not salvage, not junk, not the worthless concrete box everyone had told her she had wasted $400 on. She understood that something had been kept here, deliberately, systematically, with the intention of keeping it in conditions suitable for retrieval. And it had been sitting here, sealed, for 51 years, while the land passed through bureaucratic limbo and accumulated tax delinquency, and eventually ended up in a county auction where nobody wanted it, where she had raised her hand because it was all she could afford. She turned and looked at Emma, who was standing near the threshold with the work light throwing gold into her dark eyes, and who was looking back at her mother with a 9-year-old's absolute confidence that whatever happened next, her mother would handle it. Okay, Nora said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to close this door as much as we can. We're going to drive back to town. We're going to get a padlock from the hardware store, a good one, and we're going to come back tomorrow with proper equipment. We are not going to tell anyone what we found in here. Not yet. Emma's expression shifted slightly, the way it did when she was filing information into categories. Not Aunt Diane, not anyone. Emma looked at the shelves one more time. Then she nodded with the seriousness of someone agreeing to terms she understood completely. Okay, Mom. They pulled the door as close to closed as the damaged hinge mechanism allowed and wedged it shut with the crowbar handle and drove back to town in the fading November light, with Emma sitting in the passenger seat looking straight ahead through the windshield, not speaking, thinking whatever she was thinking. Nora drove. Her hands on the wheel were steady, which surprised her. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that she hadn't been for a long time, that particular aliveness that came from standing at the edge of something whose dimensions you couldn't yet see. Thought about the crates, the sequence numbers, the classification stamps that referenced an authority she had never heard of. Defense Reserve Authority. An acronym that appeared nowhere in any public record she had found during her late-night research, which did not necessarily mean anything except that some things were classified and some things remained classified long after the people who had classified them were gone. She thought about the date on the stenciling. September 1973. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money, it's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. The same month Nixon's administration was collapsing under Watergate, the same months in which, as she knew from her records work, an enormous volume of federal paperwork had been rerouted, misfiled, altered, or simply lost in the broader chaos of an executive branch in the middle of its worst crisis since the Civil War. Kind of moment in which a sealed installation on a county road in rural Kansas could slip off the official ledger without anyone noticing. The hardware store was still open when she pulled into the parking lot. She bought the best padlock they had, a heavy alloy with a stainless cylinder that the man behind the counter said would resist bolt cutters and weather and most attempts at forced entry. She put it in her coat pocket and drove back to Diane's house. Diane was at the counter when they came in. She looked at the padlock in Nora's hand and then at Nora's face and said, "What did you find?" "Nothing yet." Got it open. And Zora set the padlock on the counter and poured herself a glass of water and drank it before answering. "It's a storage facility. Government property, sealed. I need to go back tomorrow and look at it properly." Diane's expression traveled through several phases. Government property, like federal, it was. Now it's mine. How can federal property just end up in a county auction? I'm still working that out. Nora looked at her sister with the directness she usually reserved for situations that required it. "I need a couple of days before I talk about this with anyone. Can you give me that?" Diane had the look she got when she was weighing loyalty against concern. Loyalty won, as it usually did. 2 days. 2 days. Emma was already at the table with her homework open, pencil moving, looking like nothing out of the ordinary had happened to them today. Nora stood behind her chair for a moment and put her hand on her daughter's shoulder, and Emma didn't look up from her work, but she reached up and covered her mother's hand with her own for a moment before returning to her pencil. Nora went to the guest room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and took out her phone and began a search that would keep her up past 2 in the morning. Defense Reserve Authority, DRA, Kansas 1973, Cold War Government Reserve Assets. The results were thin. There were passing references in 3 academic papers about Cold War military planning, all of them circumspect, all of them noting that certain reserve programs of the early 1970s had been classified at a level that precluded detailed documentation in public archives. One paper, written by a historian at the University of Kansas who specialized in federal land use, noted that following the decommissionings of several classified reserve installations in 1973 and 1974, a number of sites had been improperly transferred to county jurisdiction through administrative processes that had bypassed standard federal asset recovery procedures. Properly transferred, which was a careful academic way of saying that whatever was in those installations had been left behind. She read the sentence 3 times. She put the phone down and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about row upon row of stenciled crates, about the secondary barrier at the far end of the room that she hadn't yet reached. The systematic, deliberate organization of everything she had seen, the care of people who had believed they were storing assets for retrieval, not abandonment. She thought about $400, about Emma's hand over hers. She thought about the padlock in her coat pocket and the deed in her name, and the way the cold, clean air of the sealed room had tasted in her lungs when she stepped inside. She had bought a sealed concrete box. She had opened it, and whatever happened from this moment forward, she understood with the settled certainty of someone who had been moving through uncertain water for so long that solid ground felt like a revelation. Nothing was going to be the same as it had been before she raised her hand in that basement auction room. She just didn't know yet how different it was going to be. Tomorrow she would find out. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she went straight to sleep. She was up at 5. She packed the car before Emma woke. The work lights, a second battery pack, tools, her laptop, a folder of printed research, 2 thermoses of coffee, sandwiches she made in Diane's kitchen in the quiet of early morning. She wrote Diane a note that said simply, "Going to the property. Back by evening." These lunches in the fridge. She woke Emma at 6:30. Emma sat up immediately, already alert in the way she was when she had been waiting for something, and she got dressed without being told twice and ate her cereal standing at the counter and was at the car door before Nora was. Drove out in the dark, the headlights pulling the gravel road out of the black in segments. The flat land on both sides invisible except for the faint gray distinction between ground and sky. Temperature was below freezing, and the car heater ran the whole way, and Emma sat in the passenger seat with her hands around a thermos cup that was still too hot to drink from. When they pulled up to the property, the padlock was where Nora had left it, unused, the door wedged shut as she had left it. She unlocked the padlock. She had not yet installed it on the door, just brought it for the next step, and she pulled the door open again and set up both work lights inside the threshold. This time, angling them so the beams crossed at the far end of the room and illuminated the secondary barrier she hadn't reached the night before. Emma came in behind her and stood at her shoulder. The doubled light, the room was clearer than it had been. The shelving units were military-grade steel, bolted to the concrete with anchor hardware designed to hold through the kind of shaking that standard shelving didn't survive. Crates were uniform, built to a standard, 12 inches high, 24 inches wide, 18 inches deep, with dovetail corner joints and recessed steel handles and latching mechanisms sealed with what looked like industrial wax pressed with an official stamp she couldn't read from a distance. She moved to the first crate on the left wall's bottom shelf, crouched down, and looked at the wax seal. Bore a pressed insignia, a circular seal with text around the perimeter she could only partially make out in the work light. The letters DRA were clear, the other text was worn. Beneath the seal, stamped into the wood in deep permanent ink, contents, Reserve Asset Class Alpha. She looked at the crate beside it. Contents, Reserve Asset Class Alpha, the one above it, the same. She stood and moved methodically along the shelf, reading each marking, and then along the upper shelves on the same wall, and then she crossed to the opposite wall and read those. And when she had finished, she turned and looked at Emma, who had been following 4 feet behind with a work light. Count was 96 crates, 48 on each wall, 2 rows of 24 with 2 tiers each. All of them marked Reserve Asset Class Alpha, all of them sealed, all of them bearing the DRA insignia in wax that had been there since 1973. She walked to the secondary barrier. It was a steel partition, the same gauge as the shelving units, floor to ceiling, with a lockable gate in the center that had been secured with a padlock whose shackle had rusted through at some point in the last 5 decades, so that the gate swung open under minimal pressure when she pushed against it. She stepped through and lifted the work light and let the beam fall across what was on the other side. The secondary section was smaller than the main room, 10 feet deep, the full 20-foot width. On the back wall, mounted on a steel frame bolted to the concrete, were 12 metal cases, not wooden crates. These were brushed aluminum, aircraft grade, fitted with combination locks and carrying handles and foam-padded interior seals visible through the seams of the lids. Each was labeled with a metal plate screwed into the surface, bearing text that Nora read once and then read again, because the reading of it once was not enough to make it fully real. The first plate read, Reserve Currency, Federal Reserve District 10, Denomination Class, Bearer Instruments, Quantity, See Manifest, Drare Beta 1. The second plate read, Reserve Currency, DR Beta 2, the third or Beta 3. The sequence ran to DRA Beta 12. On the floor of the secondary section, stacked in rows of 6, were items that stopped Nora's breathing for a full 4 seconds. They were rectangular, matte finish, each one roughly the size of a thick hardback book, and they were stacked in groups with spacing blocks between them, secured with nylon strapping to a low steel pallet frame. Edge of each one stamped in black, USSA Office, fine gold, 400 OZ. She counted the rows. She counted the stacks. She moved the light and counted again. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this specifically, the steadiness of her own hands, and she thought, this is what the body does when something is too large for it to react to immediately. Emma had followed her through the gate. She stood beside her mother now, holding the second work light, its beam mixing with the first to illuminate the full back section of the installation. Nora could feel her daughter looking at the same things she was looking at. Mom. Emma's voice was very quiet, the quiet of someone being careful with what they said next. Yeah, those look like gold bars. I think they are. How many? I'm still counting. Emma pointed her light at the far right pallet. There are numbers on the strapping tags. Nora moved to the nearest pallet and crouched down and read the tag on the strapping. Was a manifest tag, laminated, faded but legible, and on it were columns of data, a quantity count, a weight designation, an assay certification number, and at the bottom, in what must have been standard inventory notation for the people who had placed this here, total unit weight this pallet, 12,800 troy Oz. Fine gold. She straightened up. She looked at Emma. She looked at the pallets, 7 of them in 2 rows. She looked back at Emma. Her daughter met her eyes with absolute steadiness and said, "We should close the door." "Yeah," Nora said. "We should." They went back through the gate. Nora pulled it closed behind them. She walked to the threshold, picked up the work lights, stepped out into the cold November morning, and pulled the door shut. She inserted the padlock shackle through the hasp she had brought to install today and clicked it closed, and stood with her back to the door and her hand flat against the cold steel plate of the lock. The sky above the flat land was pale blue, cloudless. The truck passed on the highway half a mile distant, its engine sound rising and fading. Somewhere behind her, the lock held a room containing rows of sealed government crates and 12 aluminum cases of bearer instruments and 7 pallets of gold bars that she had not yet fully counted and whose total weight and value she had not yet begun to calculate. Emma stood beside her, hands in her pockets, looking at the horizon. "Mom," she said. "Yeah, we're not going to tell anyone what we found in here, are we?" Nora looked at her daughter, at the 9-year-old who had packed her own lunch and held her own dignity and put the crowbar in the back seat without being asked and stood in that room looking at the impossible and said simply, "We should close the door." "No," Nora said, "not yet. Not until we know exactly what we have and what it means and who else might have a claim to it." Emma nodded once. "What do we do first?" Nora pushed off from the door and walked back to the car and opened the driver's side and looked at her daughter across the roof. "We go back to Diane's. I use the library computer. I find out what Defense Reserve Authority actually was and whether anyone in the United States government knows this installation exists." Emma got in the car. Nora sat for a moment behind the wheel with the engine running and the heat coming back on and the morning light coming through the windshield. She thought about Diane reading the auction notice over her shoulder and laughing. And she thought about the $400 she had spent and the $349 that remained in her account. And she thought about Emma's thermos and Emma's backpack and the way Emma had covered her hand with her own small one at the kitchen table the night before. She thought about the wax seals on 96 crates that had been waiting for someone to open them since 1973. She put the car in drive. She drove back toward town with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind moving through everything that needed to happen next. Not slowly and not in panic, but with the methodical focus of someone who had spent years working in records offices and understood that documentation was the architecture of consequence. What could be proven defined what could be kept, and that before she told anyone anything, she needed to know everything there was, to know about what she had found and how she had come to find it, and what the law said belonged to the person who had paid $400 for a sealed concrete box that everyone else had decided was worth nothing. Behind her, 2 miles back on rural Route 9, the padlock held. Pratt County Public Library opened at 9 on weekdays. Nora was in the parking lot at 8:47. Emma sat beside her, doing long division in a notebook she had brought without being told to, working through problems with the focused quiet of someone who had learned that time was a resource and wasting it was a form of carelessness. Did not talk about the bunker. Nora had not decided consciously, it had just become the operating agreement between them since the drive back, the way certain understandings established themselves between people who trusted each other without needing to negotiate the terms. The library computer was free. She sat down and opened 3 browsers and spent the next 2 hours moving through government archives, academic databases, and the kind of obscure corners of FOIA process documentation that most people never encountered and that Nora could navigate because she had spent 8 years of her professional life in exactly this territory. County Records Office handled a lot of historical documentation, land transfers, probate files, institutional records going back 130 years, and she had developed the patience for primary sources that people without her background tended to lack. She knew that information rarely presented itself cleanly. You followed threads. You noted what was missing as carefully as what was there. Defense Reserve Authority. She had gotten very little the previous night. She did better this morning. The agency had existed for 11 years, from 1962 to 1973. Appeared in the Federal Register only 3 times, all three entries brief and non-descriptive, referencing appropriations at a level that did not require itemized disclosure. It had operated under the Department of Defense, but had no public-facing office, no congressional testimony on record, and no mention in any standard organizational history of the Cold War military apparatus that Nora could locate. Appeared, insofar as anything about it appeared, to have been what government historians called a black budget auxiliary, a program funded through classified line items and operated outside the standard chain of accountability that governed most federal agencies. What it had done, specifically, she pieced together from three sources that only partially overlapped. First was a 1998 academic paper in the Journal of Cold War Studies, written by a retired military historian named Leonard Foss, who had spent the last chapter of his career documenting the classified emergency preparedness infrastructure built during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He noted in a footnote on page 41 that certain reserve programs established in the early 1960s had included the physical pre-positioning of hard assets, his term, at secure installations across the continental United States, as a hedge against nuclear disruption of the financial and military supply chain. The theory, he wrote, was that if surface communications and conventional logistics were destroyed in a first strike, pre-positioned hard assets could provide the basis for a functioning resistance economy in the aftermath. He did not name the agency responsible for this program, but he cited a document number that she wrote down in her own notebook. The second source was a 2014 FOIA release processed by a journalist in Washington who had been researching Cold War financial planning. It consisted of 47 pages of partially redacted memoranda, and in the 11 pages that were not fully redacted, she found two references to the Defense Reserve Authority by name, both in the context of asset transfer orders dated August and September of 1973. Transfers were described in bureaucratic language that required careful reading, but the substance was clear enough. The DRA had been directed to consolidate its reserve holdings prior to the agency's dissolution, which had been mandated as part of the post-Vietnam budget restructuring. The consolidation orders referenced 14 installations. The memos did not list their locations. Third source was the one that made her go still in the library chair. It was a letter, processed through FOIA in 2019, written in September 1973 by a mid-level Defense Department official named Harold Mears to an unnamed superior. Most of it was redacted. 3 paragraphs had survived the redaction process, and the second paragraph read, regarding installations KS-771 through KS-777-1Cs, the consolidation orders cannot be executed on the current timeline due to transport logistics being unavailable prior to the October 15 closure date. I recommend sealing assets in place and initiating a formal retrieval directive for Q1 1974. Physical security of sites is adequate for indefinite holding. KS-771. She had found that designation the night before in the county database. It was her installation. Installation KS-771. Sealed, the database had said, and she had read that as a description and now understood it as a consequence. They had sealed the assets in place, and the Q1 1974 retrieval directive had apparently never been executed, and Harold Mears' reasonable bureaucratic recommendation had become a 51-year gap in the record while the land passed through administrative limbo and accumulated tax delinquency, and eventually appeared in a county auction listing where nobody wanted it. She sat with this for a while. Emma came and sat beside her, having finished her long division, and looked at the screen with the composed attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. Nora walked her through it in low voices because they were in the library. The program, installations, the consolidation that didn't happen, the letter. Emma read the surviving paragraphs herself. Adequate for indefinite holding, she said. That's us. That's us. Emma leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. So the government forgot it was there. The specific people who knew about it retired or moved on, and the documentation was classified well enough that nobody else knew to look. And then the agency was dissolved, and the oversight structure went with it, and the assets just stayed there. For 51 years, Emma looked at her mother. Do they still have a claim on it? Nora had been thinking about this since the night before. She had a partial answer, and she knew the partial answer was not enough. I own the land and the structure. I have the deed. Whether there are federal claims on the contents is a legal question I can't fully answer by myself. So we need a lawyer. We need a lawyer. A good one. A very good one. Nora closed the browser windows and logged off the computer. We need to go back to the property first. I need to document everything before I talk to anyone. Photographs, an inventory, everything on record. Emma stood and picked up her notebook. Today, after lunch, they ate sandwiches in the car in the library parking lot because it was cold and neither of them wanted to sit in a restaurant making small talk with anyone who might ask what they had been up to. Emma ate methodically. Nora ate half her sandwich and put the other half back in the bag because her stomach was not reliably in service. She had been doing arithmetic in the back of her mind since the morning. The gold bars she had seen were listed as 400 troy ounces per unit. Gold was trading at just under $2,000 a troy ounce. 7 pallets, and she had not finished counting the bars per pallet. But the manifest tag on the pallet she had read said 12,800 troy ounces per pallet. 7 pallets at that rate. She had done the multiplication 3 times, and the number was the same each time. And she had not been able to make herself say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud was a form of commitment to its reality that she was not ready for. She was going to open some of the crates today. She was going to photograph everything. She was going to stay methodical. Drove back out to rural Route 9 with the camera Nora had borrowed from Diane's junk drawer, a decent digital point-and-shoot that Diane's family used for vacations, and a fresh legal pad for the inventory, and 3 hours of daylight left. Padlock was undisturbed. Inside, she started at the left wall and worked right, photographing every crate from multiple angles before touching anything, logging each one in the legal pad with its shelf position, its markings, its condition. The wax seals were uniform and intact on all 96 crates. Whatever was inside them had been in continuous sealed conditions since 1973. This mattered because it meant conditions of preservation, which mattered because it would bear on value and on the question of what exactly a 51-year-old sealed government reserve program had considered worth pre-positioning in rural Kansas. She opened the first crate with a flat pry bar she had brought from the hardware run. The wax seal broke cleanly. The lid lifted on recessed hinges, and she folded it back and looked inside. The interior was lined with oil-treated cloth that had kept its integrity, dark brown, slightly stiff but not degraded. Underneath the cloth, fitted into compartments separated by dividers of the same material, were coins. Not loose coins, organized ones housed in sealed translucent sleeves that had been heat-sealed at the factory and bore small printed labels in the corner. She lifted one sleeve carefully and held it toward the work light. Gold Eagles. American Gold Eagle coins. Pre-1933, the label read, and listed a quantity of 25 coins per sleeve with a weight designation beneath it. She counted the sleeves in the crate. 24 sleeves. She did the multiplication. 600 coins in this one crate. She set the sleeve down and looked at Emma. Emma was filming on Nora's phone. They had decided this in the car. The camera for stills, the phone for continuous video record, everything dated and documented in real time. "Keep going," Emma said quietly, the way a person said it when they were trying not to interrupt something that needed to not be interrupted. Nora opened the second crate. Silver certificates, bundles of old currency, pre-963, tied with cotton ribbon and wrapped in acid-free tissue, packed in rows. Each bundle bore a band printed with a denomination and a quantity and a Federal Reserve District designation. She lifted one bundle without unwrapping it and turned it in the light and read the band. Series 1957B. Denomination $500. Quantity 200 notes. District 10. The paper was dry and perfect. Third crate. More gold eagles. Same organization, same sleeves, same quantity. Fourth crate. Treasury bonds. Sealed in a flat case inside the crate. A stack of certificated bonds with ornate engraving and Treasury Department seals, denominations she did not want to calculate before she had counted all of them. Rubber banded in groups of 10 with an index card in each group listing the face value. She stood up from the fourth crate and pressed both hands flat on the shelf edge and breathed for a moment. Emma lowered the phone. "Mom, I'm okay. You haven't said anything in 11 minutes. Nora turned and looked at her daughter, and then around the room at the 96 crates, 46 still sealed, and then at the secondary section visible through the open gate where the aluminum cases and the pallets of bullion waited. "I know what I need to do," she said, more to herself than to Emma. "I need to finish the inventory, and I need to call a lawyer, and I need to do both of those things before anyone finds out this room exists." "Do you know a lawyer?" "I know someone who knows someone." Her college roommate, Joanna, had married a man who practiced federal property law in Wichita. They had not spoken in 2 years, but Joanna was the kind of person whose number you could call after 2 years, and she would answer, and she would understand, and she would not tell anyone until you said it was time to tell people. She worked for another 2 hours, opening and documenting and resealing where she could, moving through the left wall with Emma filming and logging. Not all the crates were coins and currency. The 7th crate held military-issue timepieces, 50 of them in foam inserts, Hamilton chronographs from the 1940s, still running in several cases, sealed in individual plastic housings. The 14th crate held optical equipment, surveying instruments in leather cases with brass fittings, the kind of precision manufacturing that dated to the Second World War, and represented, even in condition unknown, the sort of things that collectors moved at significant auction prices. The 22nd crate, toward the end of the left wall's upper tier, held something different from everything else. The interior was lined with a secondary steel case bolted to the crate floor, and the steel case had its own combination lock, still sealed, with a notation card attached to the lock housing. She held the work light close to the notation card and read it. Contents, classified documentary assets, authorization required for access, to Dr. Director eyes only. If Operation Cold Harbor. She photographed the card. She did not attempt to open the steel case. She moved on. By the time the light outside the door had gone fully dark, and the temperature inside the bunker had dropped to the point where her breath was visible, she had opened and documented 31 of the 96 crates and had not yet entered the secondary section. She had enough information for a preliminary estimate that she was still not saying aloud, but the shape of which was becoming impossible to avoid. She took Emma home. Diane was making dinner. She looked at Nora's face, and then at Emma's face, and then back at Nora's, and said, "You're going to tell me something, aren't you?" "Not tonight, Nora." 2 days, Diane. I asked for 2 days. Diane turned back to the stove. Her shoulders said more than her voice had, but she let it go, which was what loyalty looked like when it was practiced, rather than just claimed. That night, Nora called Joanna from the guest room, with the door closed and Emma asleep. Joanna answered on the third ring and said, "I was wondering when you'd call. Diane told me about the divorce. When did you talk to Diane?" "Last spring." She was worried. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Diane had not told her that. "I'm okay. I have something else I need to talk to you about. Something that requires Mark." A pause. Mark was Joanna's husband, the attorney. That kind of something? "Yeah. I need to know if this is privileged from the moment I tell him." "Call him tomorrow morning. Tell him I sent you. He'll take it privilege forward from the first conversation." Joanna's voice had shifted to practical, which was one of the things Nora had always valued about her. She did not spend time on the decorative parts of a situation when the structural parts needed attention. "Nora, are you in trouble?" "I don't think so. I might be in something very large. I'm trying to determine the legal parameters before I know what it is." "Okay, no further questions. Call Mark at 8. I'll tell him you're calling." She slept better than she had any right to. She was up before Emma again, made coffee, sat at Diane's kitchen table with her legal pad, and worked through her rough inventory calculations for an hour before anyone else stirred. The gold bullion alone, if the 7 pallets were consistent with the one manifest tag she had read, was in the range of 89,600 troy ounces of fine gold. Current market that was approximately $179 million. The number sat on the legal pad in her own handwriting, and she looked at it for a long time and then wrote it again to make sure she hadn't made an arithmetic error, which she had not. She had not yet opened the 12 aluminum cases in the secondary section. She had not yet finished the remaining 65 crates. The rough estimate of the total was a number she had written in the margin and then crossed out and written again. 360 million was probably conservative. Mark's shearing answered at 8:03. Joanna had clearly spoken to him, and he moved through the preliminary exchange quickly and said, "From this moment, this conversation is privileged. Tell me what you have." She told him everything. The auction, the deed, the research, the installation designation, the Harold Mears letter, the inventory so far. She read him the crate contents descriptions from her legal pad. She told him about the gold. She told him about the classification stamps and the DRA designation and the documentary assets crate. When she stopped, the line was quiet for 5 full seconds. "Are you still there?" she said. "Here, I'm thinking." Another few seconds. Foundational question is whether a federal agency abandonment of personal property on real estate that has subsequently been transferred to private ownership through a legal chain of title constitutes a forfeiture of the federal claim on that property. That's not simple. There's case law on both sides. What does the better case law say? That when the government fails to assert a claim over a period of decades and allows the land to pass through tax delinquency and auction without executing any claim on the structure or contents, a court is likely to view that as constructive abandonment. Especially in a case where the program was classified, the documentation was not maintained in accessible form, and the agency itself was dissolved without transferring its obligations to a successor program. He paused. Key is going to be whether any active federal claim exists on record anywhere. There is no surviving federal claim documented. Your position is extremely strong. And if there is a surviving claim, then we negotiate. But Nora, listen to me. Do not touch the documentary assets crate. Do not attempt to open any classified materials. The moment you access classified government documents, the legal landscape changes, and not in your favor. I photographed the notation card on the outside. Didn't open it. Good. Leave it exactly as it is. His voice had the quality she associated with lawyers who had handled things other lawyers found complicated. A composed authority that came from having seen worse than whatever was currently in front of them. I'm going to spend this week researching the DRA and any surviving federal property claims in the Kansas District Courts. Do you have the deed? The original is with the county recorder. I have a certified copy. Keep it somewhere secure, not in that bunker, on your person or in a safe deposit box. A pause, and Nora, whatever you do, don't tell anyone what you've found. Not friends, not family, not anyone. Not until we have a clear legal framework. She thought of Emma in the doorway saying, "We should close the door." "I know," she said. The week that followed had a double life. In the mornings, she drove Emma to school and ran Diane's errands and helped with dinner and listened to Diane's children argue about whose turn it was to feed the dog, and in the afternoons, she drove out to rural Route 9 and continued the inventory. Methodical, photographed, logged. She finished the crates on day 3 of the week, coming up with a complete count that filled 4 pages of the legal pad in close handwriting. Crates contained, in total, pre-1933 American gold eagle coins numbering roughly 22,000 individual pieces across 31 crates. Silver certificates in various series, totaling a faisaliyo she had not yet calculated, but whose collector value would far exceed face. Treasury bearer bonds in denominations ranging from $500 to $5,000, dozens of them. Military and scientific instruments, chronometers, optical equipment, communication devices from the Second World War era. Miscellaneous government property whose category she marked simply as varied without trying to assess value. On day 4, she entered the secondary section with proper light and a fresh legal pad and spent 3 hours with the aluminum cases and the gold pallet inventory. The aluminum cases opened with combination locks she was not going to attempt. She photographed the exterior of each and documented the markings. DRA Beta 1 through DRA Beta 12. Bearer instruments, each case labeled. She could not determine the quantity inside without opening them, but the physical scale of each case, roughly the size of a large suitcase, and heavy enough that she could not lift one alone, suggested contents in volume. Gold pallets she finished counting. 7 pallets, each holding a stacked inventory of 400-ounce bars, and the total across all 7 when she added the pallet manifest tags was 91,200 troy ounces. She had been conservative in her overnight estimate. The gold alone, at current market, was $182 million. She sat on the concrete floor of the secondary section, with her back against the steel partition and her legal pad on her knees, and looked at the numbers. She thought about the $412 she had had in her account the morning of the auction. She thought about Emma's field trip, the $35 notice, still sitting on Diane's kitchen counter. She did not cry. Something on the other side of the scale that kept the tears from coming. Not the numbers themselves, but the weight of what the numbers meant. The distance between where she was and where she needed to be for Emma to have the childhood she deserved, and the possibility that the distance had just collapsed. She sat with that for a while, without crying and without speaking, because there was nobody to speak to, just the clean, cold air of the sealed room and the work light, and the rows of government property that had been waiting 51 years for someone to sit here and look at it. She drove back to town and called Mark. His voice had changed from the first call, still composed, but beneath the composure, something that read like controlled excitement, the register of someone who had found something. I spent 2 days in the federal property records for the Kansas district. There is no active federal claim on Lot 114 in Pratt County. Not in the county records, not in the GSA surplus property database, not in any federal court filing I can locate. DRA was dissolved under Executive Order 11740 in October 1973. There is no successor agency. The executive order contains a line about residual program assets being subject to standard GSA disposition, but GSA has no record of KS771 or any other DRA installation in their archives. They never received them. Dissolution happened in the same months as the consolidation that didn't happen, and Harold Mears's retrieval directive went into the same bureaucratic void as everything else about this program. He paused. Nora, I think you have one of the strongest adverse possession and property abandonment cases I've ever seen. The government's failure to assert a claim for 51 years, combined with the legal transfer of title through proper county tax procedures, combined with the absence of any surviving federal claim on record, puts you in an extremely favorable position. Favorable isn't certain. Nothing in law is certain. But I want to bring in a constitutional property specialist in Washington named Patricia Okafor. She has handled federal property abandonment cases at the appellate level. If she reviews this and agrees with my assessment, we file a preemptive declaratory judgment action in federal district court. Establish your ownership rights before anyone else has an opportunity to challenge them, and move forward from a position of documented legal authority rather than quiet possession. How long does that take? The filing 2 or 3 weeks once I have Patricia on board. The court's ruling potentially months. Potentially shorter if the case is as clean as it appears. He paused again. There's one more thing. Classified assets, the documentary crate, and potentially the aluminum cases, depending on their contents. There may be a parallel process involving the declassification authority and a negotiated arrangement with the relevant oversight office. That's separate from the property ownership question, but it needs to be handled carefully. Patricia will know the right contact. Nora said, "All right, bring her in." She came home to Diane's house that evening and found Diane sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the expression she wore when she had been waiting to have a conversation and was no longer willing to postpone it. "Sit down," Diane said. Nora sat. "Something is happening." Not a question. "You've been driving out to that property every afternoon for a week. You're making calls in the guest room with the door shut. Emma won't talk about what you're working on, which means you've told her not to, which means whatever it is, you decided she should know and I shouldn't." She looked at Nora steadily. "I'm not angry. I just need to know if you're safe." Nora looked at her sister across the table. She thought about Mark's instruction. She thought about Diane driving her to the hospital when Emma was born and sitting in the waiting room for 6 hours. She thought about the note on the kitchen counter, the $35 field trip notice. "I'm safe," she said. "I can't tell you details yet because there's a legal process that needs to be completed first. But I'm safe and I think everything is going to be okay." She stopped. "More than okay, Diane. Think everything is going to be very different from what it's been." Diane looked at her for a long moment. "Different how?" "I'll tell you everything when I'm allowed to." She reached across the table and put her hand over her sister's. "I need a little more time. Then I'm going to tell you everything." Diane turned her hand over and held Nora's. "Kay," she said quietly. "Kay." The first sign of trouble came 9 days after the initial call to Mark. Nora was at the property in the afternoon doing a second full photographic pass with better equipment. Mark had suggested she rent a decent camera from a photography shop in Wichita, which she had done, when a truck she didn't recognize pulled onto the gravel apron and parked beside her car. Truck was gray, no markings, government plates. The man who got out was in his 50s, compact build, close-cropped gray hair, and he wore a jacket that said nothing about who he was or what department he worked for. He looked at her, standing in the doorway of the bunker, and he looked at the open padlock hasp and the open door, and his face showed nothing particular. Miss Callahan? She had not told anyone but Mark and Joanna her name. The fact that this man knew it told her something she needed to sit with quickly and carefully. She kept her face neutral. "Who are you?" "My name is Robert Garfield. I work in the Office of Asset Management, Defense Department." He showed her a credential, a government ID card, in a leather holder that she could not read from 4 feet away. "I'd like to talk to you about this property." Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to. She kept it off her face. "My attorney handles all communications about this property." Garfield's expression shifted slightly. Something that was almost approval, the look of a man who had expected resistance and found it earlier than usual. "That's your right. I'm not here in an enforcement capacity. I'm here because the Defense Department became aware of the county sale of this parcel last month through a routine audit of property records, and we wanted to make a preliminary inquiry." "Through my attorney," Nora said again. "Mark Shearing, Shearing and Associates, Wichita." She had Mark's number memorized. She had memorized it on day 3. Garfield nodded once. He did not appear particularly troubled by this. He looked past her at the open door, and she moved slightly to put herself in the center of the frame. "I'm going to need to ask you not to do that," she said. He looked at her directly. "The contents of this installation may be subject to federal interest. That's a question for the federal courts. Until there's a ruling, this is my property. If you'd like to speak with me about it, please contact Mark Shearing." She pulled the door closed to the point the hasp allowed, keeping her body between Garfield and the interior. "I'd also ask you to leave the property now." He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he said, "Miss Callahan, I want to be straightforward with you. The assets in this installation are of historical significance and significant dollar value. The Defense Department has an interest in their proper disposition. Doesn't have to be adversarial. Contact my attorney." She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She did not feel particularly steady, but she had spent years managing situations in which she needed to appear more certain than she was, and the skill had apparently not left her. Garfield took a card from his jacket pocket and set it on the roof of her car. "For your attorney," he said. He walked back to his truck and drove away without hurrying, in the way of someone who didn't need to hurry because they had more resources than you, and both parties understood it. She called Mark before she drove off the property. He listened to the full account without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Good. You handled it exactly right. Send me the card information if you photographed it." She had. This is actually positive. Means the Defense Department is aware of the situation and has chosen to approach through a field liaison rather than through the courts, which suggests their legal team has assessed the ownership question and is not confident in a federal claim. They believed they had a strong case. They would have filed an emergency court motion, not sent a man in a jacket. "He knew my name." They pulled the deed from the county recorder. "Your name is on it. That's public record." A pause. "Patricia is on board. We're filing the declaratory judgment action Friday. Once we file, the Defense Department has to respond through proper legal channels. Informal approach stops." She drove back to town. Emma was already home from school, sitting at Diane's kitchen table with homework, and she looked up when Nora came in and read something in her mother's face with the accuracy she always brought to that particular reading. "What happened?" Nora sat across from her. "A government man came to the property." Emma set down her pencil. "What did he want?" "To establish that they know about it." Our lawyer says it's actually a sign we're in a good position. Emma thought about this, but they might try to take it. They might try. Mark says the law is on our side. Nora looked at her daughter. I want to tell you something I haven't said out loud yet, about how much might be there. Emma folded her hands on the table and waited. Nora told her. The gold, the estimated total. The number she had been writing in the margin of her legal pad and crossing out and writing again. Emma was quiet for a moment after she finished. 360 million. That's a rough figure. Could be more when we have access to the aluminum cases. Emma looked at the table surface. She had the stillness of someone receiving something almost too large to hold. Then she looked up and said, The field trip is $35. Nora's throat closed. I know. I didn't want you to worry about it. I know you didn't. She reached across the table. Emma took her hand with both of hers the way she had that first night, covering it completely. Baby, you are never going to pack your own lunch because I was on the phone with the bank again. Promise you that, Emma nodded. Her eyes were very bright and she blinked twice, and then she said, with the complete composure of someone who had decided not to cry in front of her mother because her mother was already carrying enough. Okay, good. She picked up her pencil. Are you hungry? Aunt Diane left soup on the stove. Nora laughed. Came up from somewhere unexpected, genuine, and full-bodied, and Emma looked at her with a small smile that held everything they hadn't said. Mark filed the declaratory judgment action on Friday as promised. The Federal District Court in Wichita received the filing at 10:47 in the morning and assigned it to a judge within 2 hours, which Mark said was itself a signal about the court's assessment of the case's legitimacy and urgency. Patricia Okafor had reviewed the filing and added 3 paragraphs of appellate-level argumentation about federal property abandonment that Mark said had made him revise upward his already strong confidence in their position. The weekend was quiet. Then Monday morning brought something that changed the texture of everything. Nora's phone rang at 7:20 while she was making coffee. The number was local, a Pratt County prefix. She answered, Ms. Callahan? This is Gerald Pruitt, Pruitt Land and Properties. A man's voice, easy, locally accented, confident in the way of people who had been doing business in a small town long enough to believe their reputation preceded them everywhere. I understand you purchased the Lot 114 parcel at the county auction a couple of weeks back. I did. Wonderful. I represent a buyer who is interested in acquiring that parcel from you. Given the condition of the improvements and the limited agricultural potential of the land, my client is prepared to offer you a generous premium above your purchase price. Say $4,000, 10 times your cost, clean title transfer, no contingencies. She thought about $360 million. She thought about the gold bars. She thought about Robert Garfield in his unmarked jacket, knowing her name. I'm not selling. A brief pause, the recalibrating kind. Callahan, I don't want you to feel pressured, but I should mention that in the current property climate, sealed structures without habitable improvements are very difficult to leverage. My client is willing to move quickly. 8,000, double what I just said. Who is your client? I'm not at liberty to. Then I'm not at liberty to discuss the sale. Please don't call this number again. She ended the call. She called Mark and told him about the call. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Cask, he said. What does that mean? It means Garfield went back to his office, and whoever sits above him decided that since the formal legal approach was going to go against them, they'd try to buy the property out from under you before the court rules. $1,000 is not a serious offer. It's a probe. They're testing whether you understand what you have. I understand what I have. I know you do. He paused. Nora, I need you to do something for me. I need you to secure those aluminum cases. Not open them, not move them, but I need an independent security presence at that property starting today. I know a retired U.S. Marshal who runs a private security firm out of Wichita. I want to send him out. Will that be expensive? Don't worry about that right now. She drove to the property that afternoon with Emma, who had been told school was optional today and had decided immediately in favor of the bunker. Property looked exactly as she had left it. The padlock on the hasp, the tire tracks on the gravel apron from Garfield's truck and now from hers, the flat sky and the bare cottonwood saplings inside the fence. She unlocked the door and they went in. She had been inside this room perhaps a dozen times now, and it was still affecting every time, the clean, cold air and the rows of sealed crates and the secondary section visible through the open gate. She stood in the center and turned slowly and looked at everything. Emma was beside her. What are we doing today? Finishing what we haven't done yet. She pointed at the gate. Cases. They went through to the secondary section. She had brought a better flashlight in addition to the work lights, and she aimed it at the first aluminum case and crouched down to examine the combination lock mechanism. It was an aircraft-grade lock, 3-dial, with a mechanism she recognized from her research as a standard government-issue secured container lock from the early 1970s. She was not going to attempt the combination. She had been clear with herself about this since Mark's instruction, but she ran her flashlight along the seam of the case lid and along the base, and she noticed something she had not noticed before. On the base of DRA Beta 1, facing the wall, a small metal tag. She tilted the case slightly with both hands to read it. Tag was a contents manifest, standard format, typed on a card that had been laminated and riveted to the base. She held the flashlight close. Case Dr. Beta 1, contents, bearer bonds, U.S. Treasury, Series 1963-1972, total face value, $14,500,000, security class, reserve alpha. Retrieve upon directive, $14.5 million, one case. She checked DRA Beta 2, $12 million, DR Beta 3, $16 million. She moved along the row, tilting each case to read the base tag, Emma following with the flashlight beam. 12 cases. The face values ranged from 11 to 17 million each. When she had read all 12, she straightened up and looked at the column of numbers on her legal pad. The bearer bonds alone, at face value, came to $163 million. She wrote the total below the gold estimate. She added them. She looked at the number for a long time. Then she wrote, additional inventory TBD. Rare coins collector value above spot. Currency notes collector value above face. Instruments. Equipment, classified assets. The number she had been writing in the margin for 2 weeks was not conservative. Might be, she understood now, standing in the secondary section of a sealed Cold War installation on rural Route 9 in Pratt County, Kansas, slightly short of the truth. She turned to Emma. Emma was looking at her mother's legal pad. Her eyes moved down the column of numbers. She looked up. Mom, she said. Ha. When you say this is ours. She stopped and started again, with the careful precision she brought to things that mattered. When the court rules, all of this is actually legally, completely ours. Yeah. Emma looked at the cases. Pallets. At the rows of crates, visible through the gate behind them. What do we do with it? Nora looked at her daughter. At the question she had not allowed herself to think about yet, because allowing herself to think about it would have required believing it was real, and she had spent the last 2 weeks living carefully inside the boundary of what was documented and proven and legally defensible, not reaching beyond it into the territory of what if and what then. She said, "That's the most important question anyone has ever asked me." Emma nodded as if this confirmed something. "I have some ideas," she said. Nora almost laughed again. She didn't. Tell me, not yet, when it's real. Outside, somewhere distant, a car on the highway. The flat sound of wind across open ground, the work lights hum. 51 years of sealed air and sealed consequence surrounding them both. 3 days later, Gerald Pruitt called again. This time the offer was $50,000. Then, 6 hours after she told him again that she was not selling, and he should stop calling, a white SUV parked at the end of the gravel driveway and sat there for 40 minutes before driving away without anyone getting out. She called Mark. He said the security firm was starting Thursday. She said, "Tell them to start tomorrow." That night, Diane's house was quiet at 11 when everyone was in bed, and Nora sat at the kitchen table with her legal pad and the photographs on her laptop and the number at the bottom of the inventory page. She thought about the morning of the auction. The way nobody else had raised a hand. The way Garrett had brought the gavel down on a bid nobody wanted, on a parcel nobody had looked at carefully enough, on a sealed concrete box on less than an acre of Kansas scrubland that everyone had looked at and seen nothing. She thought about her 8 cents at the library printer, the folded paper in her pocket, the decision that had felt like desperation and was, she now understood, the only accurate instinct she had trusted in months. She thought about Emma saying, "Not yet, when it's real." She closed the laptop and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about Robert Garfield and Gerald Pruitt, and whoever was sitting in their offices right now deciding what to try next, people with resources and connections and institutional weight behind them. And she thought about Mark and Patricia and the declaratory judgment sitting in federal court. And she thought about the padlock on rural Route 9 holding through the cold night. She was not afraid. She had been afraid for months, the specific fear of someone with nothing, no margin, no fallback, nothing left to lose except a daughter she could not afford to fail. Fear had a texture she knew precisely. What she felt now was different. What she felt now was the particular alertness of someone who had everything to protect and was learning, day by day, that she was capable of protecting it. She had opened a door. She had documented what was behind it. She had secured it with a lock and a lawyer and a record and a daughter who said, "Not yet, when it's real." Court would rule. The number would be confirmed. The government men and the property brokers and the people sitting in distant offices making calculations about what she understood and what she didn't would learn what she had known since she stood in that room and kept her hands steady. She knew exactly what she had. She knew exactly what it meant, and she was not going anywhere. The security firm sent 2 men. They arrived Thursday morning in a truck that was unremarkable by design, pulled onto the gravel apron, and set up a weatherproof monitoring station in a trailer they parked alongside the bunker wall. The lead man, a former marshal named Dale Hutchins, who had a handshake that communicated he had met most varieties of human difficulty and been unimpressed by them, walked the property perimeter with Nora for 40 minutes while she explained the situation in the careful terms Mark had coached her to use. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical, and then he said the property would be monitored around the clock until legal resolution, and that she should go home and let him do his job. She drove back to town feeling lighter than she had since Garfield's first visit. The white SUV did not reappear. Gerald Pruitt did not call again. Whether this was because Dale Hutchins's presence communicated something the sight of a single woman and a child had not, or because Mark's filing had changed someone's legal calculus, she did not know. Was quiet in the way that quiet sometimes was when something had shifted in an argument that hadn't yet found its spoken form. The federal district court scheduled the preliminary hearing for the 3rd week of November, 26 days after the filing. Mark said the speech itself was meaningful, that courts did not fast-track property cases without reason, and that the judge assigned a woman named Constance Hale, who had served on the federal bench for 14 years, had a documented history in property law that suggested she was unlikely to waste time on proceedings she did not find legally substantive. Nora drove to Wichita for the hearing. She left Emma with Diane, who had been told only that there was a court proceeding about the property and that Nora needed her to be home. Diane had said, of course, without asking questions, which was the version of grace that Diane had always been capable of when it mattered. Federal Courthouse in Wichita was a building that worked at seriousness through its architecture, wide steps and heavy doors and marble floors that absorbed sound in a way that made everything feel deliberate. Patricia Okafor met her in the lobby. She was tall, 50 or so, and she carried herself with the specific self-possession of someone who had argued in rooms like this one many times and had not been diminished by any of them. She shook Nora's hand and said, "You're prepared," which was not a question. "I am." "Good. Today is procedural. We present the foundational argument and the documentary evidence. Judge asks questions. We answer them fully and without qualification. You don't need to speak unless Judge Hale addresses you directly." The Department of Justice had sent 2 attorneys to represent the federal government's preliminary interest in the case. Sat across the aisle with the composed attention of people who had not yet decided whether they needed to be worried. The older one, a man who wore his suit the way career government lawyers did, had reviewed the filing. This was clear from the notes in his hand, and his expression when Nora came in suggested he had formed an opinion he was not yet ready to express. Judge Hale entered without ceremony. She was compact and direct, with the economy of movement that came from spending years in rooms where time was scarce and imprecision was expensive. She looked at the filing in front of her and then at both tables and said, "Counsel, I have read this filing in full. I have some questions. Let's begin." The hearing lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Patricia argued the abandonment and adverse possession framework with a precision that made Nora understand why Mark had called her without hesitation. She cited case law the government attorneys had not cited in their preliminary response. She addressed the DRA dissolution order and its failure to create a successor obligation with the kind of specificity that required the government's attorneys to confer twice before responding. Then she handed the judge's clerk a folder of documentation that included the Harold Mears letter, the DR installation registry entry, 40-page legal analysis that Patricia had prepared in the 2 weeks since coming on board. The government's attorneys argued that the federal interest in the property's contents was not extinguished by the administrative failures of a dissolved agency, and that the national security classification of certain materials created an ongoing federal claim regardless of the real estate's ownership status. Judge Hale listened to both sides without expression. She asked Nora one question directly, which was whether she had at any point accessed any classified materials inside the installation. Nora said she had not, and that she had documented the existence of sealed classified items and preserved them in their original condition pending legal resolution. The judge nodded once and made a note. At the end of the hearing, Judge Hale looked at both tables and said, "I am not issuing a ruling today. I will review the documentation in full and issue a written ruling within 30 days. In the interim, the property and all contents remain in the possession of Ms. Callahan as the deed holder, with the condition that no classified materials be accessed or removed pending the ruling." She looked at the government's table. The Department of Justice is on notice that any attempt to access or remove property from this installation prior to the court's ruling will be treated as a contempt action. She stood. We're adjourned. It was not a ruling. The weight of a federal judge putting herself between Nora and the people who wanted what she had found, and the drive back to Pratt County had a different quality than the drive out. She called Mark from the parking garage. That went as well as it possibly could have, he said, before she finished describing it. Hale's interim condition is a ruling in everything but name. 30-day window is standard form. I'll be surprised if we wait 30 days. What do you think she'll decide? I think she read the Bromier's letter and the DR Day dissolution order and the absence of any surviving federal claim, and understood that the government allowed this property to pass through public auction without asserting a claim it had 50 years to assert, and that the law does not reward that kind of institutional neglect, regardless of what was inside the structure. He paused. Think she'll rule for you, Nora. She sat in the parking garage for a while after the call. Gray concrete walls, the fluorescent light, the engine ticking down to silence around her. She had started this in a county courthouse basement with 20 people and a folded piece of paper. The distance between that morning and this one was 26 days and a number she had written in the margin of a legal pad, and the distance felt both very short and like the longest she had ever traveled. She drove home. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up when Nora came through the door, and Nora said, "It went well," and Emma said okay and went back to her work, which was how Emma indicated she trusted the adults managing something she had decided not to spend energy worrying about. Diane was in the living room pretending to read a magazine and not pretending very hard. She looked at Nora's face, and whatever she saw there made her exhale slowly and say, "Good, not final yet, but good." Diane nodded. She did not ask anything else. She went back to her magazine. The ruling came on day 19. Not 30, 19. Mark called at 8:40 in the morning, which was earlier than he had ever called, and his voice had the specific quality of someone trying to keep the excitement out of a register they had trained to stay neutral. "We have the ruling." She had been standing at Diane's kitchen counter. She sat down at the kitchen table. "Tell me." He read the relevant section in full. Judge Hale's language was measured and permanent and left no interpretive gap that could be navigated by an appeal filed on narrow grounds. The court found that the United States government, through the dissolution of the Defense Reserve Authority in October 1973 and the subsequent failure to execute any retrieval directive, assert any property claim, or maintain any documented interest in installation KS 7714 across a period of 51 years, had effected a constructive abandonment of the personal property contained within the structure. The court further found that the transfer of the real property through proper county tax delinquency procedures to private ownership constituted a lawful transfer that the federal government, having had full opportunity to contest at any point across 5 decades, had no legal standing to challenge retroactively. Personal property contained within the structure on the date of the real property transfer to Ms. Nora Callahan was found to pass with the real property under the doctrine of constructive attachment. The sole exception was the classified documentary materials, which the court referred to a parallel declassification proceeding with the National Archives, while ordering that the physical materials remain in Nora's possession pending that proceeding's completion, and that any federal interest in those materials be addressed through negotiated settlement rather than confiscation. She belonged to her. All of it, except the single sealed case whose contents she had not opened and did not know, and even that was in her possession pending a process that Mark said strongly favored a negotiated outcome. Nora. Marx had lost the attempt at neutrality. Congratulations. She did not say anything for a moment. She sat at Diane's kitchen table, where she had eaten dinner every night for 7 months, and looked at the surface of it, the scratches and the water rings, and the small gouge near the corner where one of Diane's kids had scraped a fork across it by accident. And she let the reality of what had just happened settle into her at the speed it needed to, rather than faster. "Okay," she said finally. "What's next?" "Appraisal. I have a team standing by, a numismatist for the coins and currency, a bullion assessor for the gold, a bond specialist for the bearer instruments, and a general government property appraiser for the remaining contents. Can be on site within 48 hours. After the appraisal, we have full documentation of value, and we can begin the financial disposition process." "And the classified materials?" "I've already been contacted by the National Archives Office. Want to negotiate. Their opening position is that we grant access to the materials in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of the program's existence and compensation for the historical value of the documentary record." He paused. "My recommendation is that we let Patricia handle that negotiation. The leverage is entirely yours." Emma came into the kitchen at 8:57 in her school clothes with her backpack already on. She looked at her mother's face. She put her backpack down and sat across the table without saying anything. Nora looked at her daughter, at the girl who had put the crowbar in the back seat, who had stood in the secondary section and said, "We should close the door," who had said, "Not yet, when it's real." "It's real," Nora said. Emma looked at her steadily. Her expression moved through something she did not try to hide, and then settled into something quieter, something that lived beneath the surface of the moment rather than on top of it. "Okay," she said. She picked up her backpack. "Still have to go to school." Nora drove her to school. On the way home, she stopped at the hardware store, not for supplies. She didn't need supplies. She stopped because she needed somewhere to stand for a minute that wasn't Diane's kitchen, somewhere ordinary. And she stood in the hardware store, looking at padlocks for a while, before going back to her car and calling her sister. "Come home," she said, "to tell you something." She told Diane everything at the kitchen table with the door to the living room closed, starting with the auction morning and the lot notice, and ending with the ruling that had come in 40 minutes ago. She told her about the crates and the gold and the aluminum cases and the bearer bonds. She told her about Garfield and Pruitt and Dale Hutchins and Mark and Patricia and Judge Hale. She told her about the number. Diane sat across from her through all of it without speaking. When Nora stopped, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, "The $400. Yeah, that's why you took it from the account. I needed to do something. It was the only thing I could afford." Diane was quiet again. Her eyes had filled, and she was visibly not letting herself cry, pressing her lips together in the way she had since childhood, when she was determined to get through something without showing how much it affected her. "I laughed at you," she said. "You were worried. It looked insane. It looked insane. It was $400 in a sealed concrete box." She shook her head slowly. "I told Marcus and Kevin at dinner that night that you'd bought a concrete box with your last $400. What did they say?" Marcus said that was the most Nora thing he'd ever heard, a small break in her voice. He meant it kindly. Nora reached across the table. Diane took her hand hard, the way she'd taken it the night Emma was born, the grip of someone hanging on to something they needed to not let go of. Her shoulders shook once, and then she got herself back under control because she was Diane, and that was how Diane worked. "I should have said I believe you," Diane said. "Every time you looked like you knew what you were doing, and I looked like I was waiting for you to fail. I should have said I believe you. You drove me to the hospital." "That's the floor, Nora." That's the minimum. Nora held her sister's hand across the table that belonged to Diane's house, where she had been sleeping in a guest room for 7 months. She thought about all the forms a person's love took when it was real versus when it was comfortable, and how the difference between them was not always cruelty, but was sometimes just the limits of imagination, ordinary failure to see past what something looked like to what it was. "I'm going to need your help," Nora said, "with what comes next. I don't know how to do what comes next, and I'm going to need people I trust." Diane wiped her eyes once with the back of her hand. "Tell me what you need." The appraisal team arrived Friday morning. 3 vehicles on the gravel apron, specialists in their respective fields with equipment cases and clipboards, and the focused efficiency of people who understood they were being paid to be thorough rather than fast. Dale Hutchins met them at the perimeter and walked them in. Nora was there. Emma had gone to school because school was not optional on Fridays, and Emma had decided this independently, which was how she made most decisions. The numismatist was a woman named Dr. Clara Voss, who had spent 20 years at a Chicago auction house before going independent, and she walked into the main room and stood looking at the shelving with an expression that took several seconds to resolve from disbelief to professional assessment. She pulled on gloves and began at the first crate, working with an eye loupe and a reference catalog she had brought from her equipment case, moving through the coin sleeves with the careful speed of someone who had held a great many rare coins and understood their language. After 40 minutes, she came to Nora and said, "The pre-1933 gold eagles are in exceptional condition. Uncirculated or near uncirculated across the sample I've reviewed. Contemporary auction conditions, the numismatic premium above spot value is significant." She looked at her notes. "I'll need a full day to complete the coin assessment, but my preliminary range for the coinage alone is between $40 and $55 million at current market." The bond specialist, a man named Felix Grantham, who spoke in the precise language of someone who had learned that imprecise language in his field had consequences, spent most of the morning in the secondary section with the aluminum cases, which Mark had authorized him to open using the original combination protocols he had researched from government records of the period. He emerged after 2 hours with his clipboard and a look of controlled concentration and reported that the bearer bonds were in pristine condition, that their face values were as Nora had documented, and that several series within the cases were additionally notable for historical collector interest given their provenance. Face value of the bond holdings is $168,400,000, he said. Provenance premium, the figure is somewhat higher. I'll specify in the written report. The bullion assessor was methodical and unhurried. He weighed samples and tested purity and cross-referenced the assay certificates against federal mint records. And at the end of the afternoon, he gave Nora a handwritten note that said 91,200 Troy Oz. Confirmed fine gold, current spot 182,100 to the 400. He had underlined the figure. She looked at the note and then at the room. General appraiser spent 2 days on the remaining contents. Military chronometers in working condition. Optical instruments with documented provenance from wartime production contracts. Scientific equipment. Communications devices. Currency notes whose collector value in their preserved condition exceeded their face value by multiples she had not anticipated. At the end of the second day, he produced a preliminary summary that listed a miscellaneous contents value of between $11 and $15 million, pending full catalog completion. On the 5th day, Mark called with the preliminary total. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of Emma's school, waiting for the dismissal bell when the call came. She answered, Mark said the number. It was not 360 million. It was, on the conservative end of the appraisals, $412 million. Precise figure would require the formal appraisal documents and the resolution of the classified materials negotiation. But the 400 million threshold had been crossed before the classified assets were factored at all. She did not speak for a moment. "Nora, I'm here." She watched the school's front doors, waiting for them to open. "I'm here, Mark. The financial disposition process will take several months. There are tax considerations, transfer mechanisms, the bond redemption process. But the legal ownership is established, and the appraisal is documented, and you are, as of today, in possession of assets that will make you one of the wealthier private individuals in the state of Kansas once the process is complete." The school doors opened. Children poured out. She watched them and found Emma in the flow, backpack on, chin up, walking with the deliberate, quiet dignity she had been walking with all year. Emma saw the car and changed direction toward it. "Thank you, Mark," Nora said, "for everything. It's been the most interesting case of my career." Patricia says the same. A pause. "Nora, you did this." She put the phone down and unlocked the doors. Emma got in and put her backpack between her feet and pulled her seatbelt across and looked at her mother. "The appraiser finished," Nora said. Emma read her face. She had been reading her face for 9 years with more accuracy than most adults managed. "How much?" Nora told her. Emma was quiet. Outside the car, the school parking lot emptied around them in the ordinary noise of pickup lines and parent calls and the end-of-week energy of children being released from 5 days of sitting still. Emma sat in the middle of all of it and looked through the windshield and was very quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The field trip is $35. I know, I want to pay for it myself." From the first disbursement. "Whatever the smallest amount is that comes first, I want to use $35 of it for the field trip." Nora looked at her daughter. Why? Emma thought about how to say it. She was careful with words the way she was careful with most things, not slow, just precise. "Because I want to remember what $35 felt like. When it was a problem." She paused. "I don't want to be someone who forgets what that felt like." The parking lot had mostly emptied. The November light came flat and gold through the windshield, the late afternoon kind that made ordinary things look briefly considered. Nora sat with her daughter in it and thought about the person she was raising and felt, underneath the relief and the disbelief and the exhaustion of weeks of sustained alertness, something that was simply gratitude, uncomplicated, without the shadow of everything that had been pressing against it for months. "Okay," she said, $35 from the first disbursement." Emma nodded. She picked up her backpack. "Can we go home?" They had not talked about what home meant yet, the practical question of it. Diane's spare room was still theirs, and Diane had said nothing about changing that. But the question of what came next was present in every ordinary moment now, visible the way things were visible once you knew where to look. "Soon," Nora said. "Figure out home soon." The negotiation over the classified materials concluded 6 weeks after the court ruling. Patricia handled it with the particular competence she brought to situations where one side had leverage it had not expected to have. National Archives Office had initially proposed access in exchange for a formal acknowledgement and a modest compensation figure that Patricia described on the phone as polite fiction. After 2 rounds of negotiation in which Patricia was not polite and the compensation figure was revised substantially upward, the agreement reached was this. Nora would grant the National Archives access to the Operation Cold Harbor documentation case under conditions she specified, including independent historical review and public disclosure within 10 years. The federal government would pay a historical preservation and cooperation fee of $4 million. She had asked Patricia what Operation Cold Harbor was. Patricia said she could tell her what the archivist had disclosed during negotiations, which was that it was a documentary record of classified communications between senior defense officials and financial institutions from 1963 to 1973, relating to the establishment and management of the reserve program. The archivist had called it, in Patricia's recounting, an irreplaceable primary source for the history of Cold War financial preparedness policy. Is there anything in it that changes what we already know? Nora asked. Not about your case, about the history of the period, possibly. That's for the historians. A pause. The archivist also said, off the record, that it had been one of the most significant archival finds she had encountered in 20 years of work. Robert Garfield called the week after the negotiation was concluded. Not on behalf of the Defense Department this time. He had apparently moved to a different office, the nature of which he did not specify. But as himself, with a brevity that suggested he had thought about whether to make this call for a while. He said that he had reviewed the case documentation and that he wanted her to know he had not been involved in the Gerald Pruitt calls or the white SUV, which had been authorized by a level above him and which he had not sanctioned. She said she believed him. He said he thought the right outcome had been reached. She said thank you. They ended the call. Gerald Pruitt had not called again after Mark's filing went public record. She had not thought about him much. She thought about him slightly less after she stopped. Appraisal documents were finalized in January. Total, with the classified materials compensation and the full numismatic assessment completed, was $419 million. The number had been a range, and now it was a figure, documented and certified, and when she saw it in the appraisal report in black type on white paper, it looked less dramatic than the moment it had first been said aloud, and more like a fact, which was what it was. She told Diane the final number on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen with the door closed, and Emma in the next room, and Diane's family out. Diane sat very still for a moment after she heard it. Then she said, "You need better advisors than Mark. Mark is excellent. Mark is a property lawyer in Wichita. You need a team." She had already opened her laptop. "I know a wealth management firm in Kansas City that handled Diane, the Collingsworth estate, and the number was comparable." Diane. Her sister looked up from the laptop. Nora looked at her across the table. "I know I need a team," Nora said. "I want you on it." Diane stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I need someone I trust to help manage what comes next, and I want it to be you. I'm not asking you to leave your life. I'm asking you to be part of mine." She paused. "The way you've always been part of mine." Diane looked at her for a long moment. Her expression did through several things. Then she turned back to the laptop and said, "The Kansas City firm is called Mercer and Associates. They handle high-value estate management, and they have a social impact division." She turned the screen so Nora could read it. "I've been looking at them for 3 months." Nora looked at her sister. "I knew something was happening," Diane said without looking up from the screen. "I just didn't know how big. The house search took 2 months. Emma had one requirement, stated once and without revision: a yard big enough for a dog. Nora had several requirements that she held more loosely than Emma held hers. She wanted somewhere real, by which she meant somewhere with a kind of ordinariness that would not make her feel like she was performing a version of a life rather than living one. She was not interested in a house that announced its price at 50 feet. She was interested in a house that she could walk into and feel, the way she had felt in the bunker on the first morning, that it had been waiting, found it in March. Not in Pratt County, slightly west of Wichita, a converted farmhouse on 4 acres with a wide porch and mature cottonwoods along the drive, and a yard that was, by any objective measure, large enough for a dog. It had been renovated carefully by its previous owner, without erasing the qualities that made it what it was. And when Nora walked through it the first time with Emma beside her, she felt the particular recognition she had felt standing in front of the sealed door on rural Route 9. She knew it before she could explain knowing it. Emma walked out the back door and stood in the yard and turned around once, slowly, looking at the space. She said nothing. Then she came back inside and said, "This one." They moved in on a Tuesday in March with Diane's family helping. Guest bed that Emma had slept in at Diane's was disassembled and donated to the shelter in Wichita, along with a check that covered 6 months of family housing placement, which Emma had specified as the condition for giving up the bed rather than selling it. Emma's room in the new house had a window that looked into the cottonwoods. She arranged her things with the same methodical care she brought to everything. And when she was done, she stood in the center of the room and looked at it for a while. Then she went downstairs and helped Diane unpack the kitchen. The dog came 3 weeks later. Beagle from the county shelter, 8 months old, with ears too large for his head, and an approach to life so comprehensively optimistic it bordered on a worldview. Emma named him without consulting anyone and announced the name at dinner. Nora said, "$1?" "He costs $35, Emma said. Nora looked at her daughter across the kitchen table of their house. Emma was eating her soup with the same focused quiet she brought to all meals, and she did not look up, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly. "Okay," Nora said. $1. The question Emma had asked in the secondary section of the bunker, "What do we do with it?" had been gestating for 4 months by the time Nora was in a position to act on it. The financial disposition had taken the time it took. The accounts had been structured with the Mercer team. The tax framework had been established. The bond redemption had moved through its process. By April, the money was real in the practical sense, accessible, allocated, organized, and the question could finally be answered with something more than intention. Emma had produced a handwritten document in February, 2 pages in her precise handwriting, which she had folded in half and given to Nora with the words, "When you're ready." Nora had read it once and put it in the desk in her study, and not read it again until April, because reading it once had been enough to know what she was going to do. The document was titled in Emma's handwriting with characteristic directness, "Things I Think We Should Do." It had 2 sections. The first section was 4 lines. Pay for Emma's field trip, get a dog. Buy a house with a yard, help Aunt Diane however she needs. The second section was longer. It described, in the precise language of a 9-year-old who had thought carefully about something, the experience of being in a car with nowhere to go. Not in abstract terms, in specific ones. Parking lot where they had spent 2 nights in October because the shelter had no space. The library bathroom where Emma had brushed her teeth on 4 consecutive mornings and had not told Nora she had been doing this because she didn't want Nora to feel worse than she already felt. The way uncertainty about where to sleep made it impossible to think about anything else. The way the mind narrowed around the immediate problem, and everything that should have been available to a child, school, learning, ordinary small pleasures, went somewhere inaccessible. She had written, "I think some of the money should go to families who are in the parking lot phase. Not because we should feel guilty for having what we have now, but because being in the parking lot phase is survivable if someone helps, and not having anyone help makes it much harder. And we know that." Nora had read this in February and understood that her daughter had been thinking about it not as a transaction or an obligation, but as something self-evident, the way she understood most things, through direct and uncomplicated attention to what was real. Callahan Family Foundation was established in May. Founding gift was $20 million, designated for emergency family housing and transitional support across 3 counties, with a priority structure that put the parking lot phase first. Not shelters, which operated on institutional timelines that didn't align with the acute moment of crisis. Direct placement, direct support, families with children given bridge housing, while longer-term options were located. Emma was on the foundation's advisory board. This had been Nora's condition, established before the foundation's structure was finalized, and the attorney who had done the incorporation work had looked at her across the table and said children didn't sit on advisory boards, and Nora had said this one does, and that had been the end of that. The first family the foundation helped was placed in April, a few weeks before the foundation was formally incorporated. Through an emergency provision Nora had made with the shelter in Wichita to move the process before the paperwork caught up with the intention. A woman with 2 kids, a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, who had been in a shelter for 11 days and whose placement options had stalled in a bureaucratic process that had no mechanism for urgency. They were placed in a rental the foundation had secured on a 30-day lease, while permanent housing was arranged. Emma had gone with Nora to drop off the keys and meet them. The 7-year-old had a backpack with a broken zipper that he had been holding shut with his hand. Emma had looked at the backpack and then at Nora, and Nora had nodded, and Emma had reached into her own bag and taken out the small emergency supply kit she had been carrying since October, the one she had assembled at Diane's house with her own allowance money before they'd had anything, and she had given it to the boy without ceremony and said he could have it. He had looked at it for a moment. Then he had put it in his broken zippered bag and held the zipper shut again. Emma had watched this and not said anything and walked back to the car. The car, she said, "We need to buy backpacks for the foundation, for kids who come through, good ones with working zippers." She looked straight ahead. "It matters." They bought backpacks. 100 to start on Emma's specification, quality ones with working zippers and room for the things a child needed, and they were stocked in a storage room at the foundation's first office. A modest space on a side street in Wichita that Diane had found and furnished with the focused practicality she brought to everything she took on. The bunker on rural Route 9 had been properly cleaned and documented and locked with a security system after the appraisal team's departure, and Nora had not been back since January. She drove out to it in June, alone, on a clear morning when the Kansas sky was the full, cloudless blue it managed in early summer before the heat arrived. She parked on the gravel apron and sat for a moment before getting out. Property looked the same as it had in November. The barbed wire fence, cottonwood saplings coming back into leaf now, greener than she had seen them. Flat expanse of grass inside the perimeter. The bunker, its exterior unchanged, the weld seam she had ground through, still visible as a clean line in the weathered concrete. She got out and walked to the door and stood in front of it. It was locked now with a professional security system rather than the abloy padlock from the hardware store. She had the code. She did not enter. She stood outside and put her hand flat on the door the way she had that first day, when the door was still sealed and the world was still the way it had been before, and she felt the cold metal through her palm and the November air, and thought about everything that had stood on either side of this door. She had been 34 years old with $412 and a daughter who packed her own lunch. She had been afraid with the specific fear of someone who had run out of margin, who understood that the next thing that went wrong might be the thing there was no recovering from. She had seen a listing for a sealed concrete box and raised her hand, not because she knew what was inside it, but because she had nothing left to lose, and the imaginable chance that something might be different was still a chance. And she had learned from months of difficulty that you took the chances when they came, regardless of how small they were. She had not known about the gold. She had not known about the bonds or the coins or the 51-year gap in the federal record or Harold Mears's letter or Operation Cold Harbor or any of the specific architecture of the thing she had stumbled into. She had known only that a door existed, and she could afford to try it, and she was not going to sit in a parking lot one more night if there was anything she could do instead. She thought about Emma in the car that first afternoon, watching the bunker through the windshield with her hands in her pockets. Is it ours? She had said yes before she knew what yeses would mean, because the deed said yes, and the deed was real, and sometimes you committed to the truth of a thing before you understood its full dimensions. She thought about Emma's document, the parking lot phase, the backpacks with working zippers. She thought about what $400 was and what $419 million was, and the distance between them, which was also the distance between a printed lot. Notice folded soft at the creases, and a foundation that was families and buying backpacks, and doing the thing Emma had identified as the self-evident response to having more than you needed. Helping people who were in the moment you had been in, because being in it was survivable with help, and without help it was much harder. She stood at the door for a while longer. Then she walked back to the car and drove home. Emma was in the yard with Dollar when she pulled in. The dog was conducting what appeared to be an investigation of a section of the fence line, which he pursued with the absolute commitment of someone with both time and conviction. And Emma was watching him with her arms folded and the expression she wore when something was amusing her, but she had decided not to show it. Nora got out of the car. Emma said, "He found something. What did he find?" "I don't know. He's been looking at it for 20 minutes. Dollar emerged from the fence line with a dignity that suggested whatever he had found had been adequately assessed and was no longer requiring his attention. He trotted across the yard and sat at Nora's feet and looked up at her with the comprehensive optimism he brought to everything. "Good find?" Nora said. Dollar did not clarify. Emma looked at her mother. "You went to the bunker?" "Yeah. How was it?" Nora considered the question honestly. "The same. It's just a room now." Emma nodded as if this was the answer she had expected. "That makes sense." She uncrossed her arms and picked up a stick from the grass, not to throw it, just to have something in her hands, turning it once. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." Emma looked at the cottonwoods along the drive, the late afternoon light in the new leaves. "When I'm older. When I know enough about how the world works to do it properly." She paused, choosing the words. "I want to run the foundation, not just sit on the board. Action." Nora looked at her daughter. Emma looked back at her with the steadiness she had always had, the particular quality that had carried her through months of difficulty in a way that had made Nora feel, in equal and alternating measure, that she had done something right and that her daughter had arrived at her own character without much help from anyone. "I know the parking lot phase from the inside," Emma said. "That's not nothing." It was not nothing. It was. Nora understood, standing in the yard of the house they had found together, beside the cottonwoods that had been planted by someone they would never meet, in the state where she had raised her hand in a courthouse basement on the last real chance she had. It was, in fact, the whole thing, the reason the door had been worth opening. The reason the $400 had been the right decision even when it had looked like the worst one. Not the gold, not the bonds, not the number in the appraisal report. This. Emma with a stick in her hand saying, "I know it from the inside, and that's not nothing." "No," Nora said. "It's not nothing." Dollar found another section of fence requiring investigation and departed at speed. Emma watched him go with the small, almost suppressed amusement she had been suppressing all afternoon. "He's not very good at being a dog," she said. "He's excellent at being Dollar." Emma almost smiled. "That's true." The light was going gold across the yard, the particular long light of a Kansas evening in early summer, and the cottonwoods threw their shadows across the grass in patterns that shifted with the wind. Nora stood in the yard of her house with her daughter and thought about a sealed door in a cold room, and 96 crates and a 9-year-old's handwriting that said, "I think we should help families in the parking lot phase, not because we should feel guilty, but because we know that it's survivable with help." She thought about $412, about a folded piece of paper soft at the creases, about a crowbar in the back seat, placed there without being asked. She thought about what it meant to raise your hand when nobody else did. Not because you knew what was on the other side, because you had learned that the worst outcome of trying was the same as the outcome of not trying, and the best outcome was something you could not yet see. And between those two possibilities, the choice was simple, even when everything else was not. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Dollar barked at the fence. Emma turned toward the house. "I'm making dinner," she said. "It's my turn." Nora stayed in the yard a moment longer. She looked at the sky, which was doing what Kansas skies did in June, going slowly through colors that had no names, the specific gradation between day and the first hint of evening when the light had not yet committed to leaving, but was clearly thinking about it. She had not stood in a yard like this, her yard, in a very long time. She had not known what standing in it would feel like when it was real, when the deed was hers, and the number was confirmed, and the foundation was placing families, and Emma was inside, making dinner, in the house they had found together. Felt, she decided, like the distance between the parking lot and a yard with cottonwoods, measured not in money, but in the simple, irreducible fact of being somewhere you were allowed to stay. Inside, something started cooking. The smell of it came through the screen door. Dollar came and sat beside her. She went in. Field trip was to the Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, which was a space museum, and Emma had known about it since the first week of school when the teacher handed out the permission slips, and Emma had folded hers into her backpack without mentioning it. Nora had found it there in October during one of the nights. She had gone through Emma's bag looking for anything that needed signing, and she had smoothed it flat and looked at the $35 fee and put it back in the bag and not said anything because there was nothing to say that would not have made it worse. Emma had never submitted the slip. In May, after the first disbursement cleared and the foundation account was open and the practical architecture of the new life was real, in the specific way that bank statements made things real, Emma came to Nora's study with a $35 bill she had taken from the small household account Nora had set up for her, and she set it on the desk. "It's not the same field trip," she said. "That one already happened. I know. But I want to give this to the school for the next one. For a kid whose parents couldn't." She looked at the bill on the desk. "I want it to be anonymous. I don't want anyone to know it was me." Nora looked at her daughter. "Why anonymous?" Emma thought about this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. Because when someone paid for something for us, and we knew who it was, it felt like something we owed. "Don't want anyone to feel that." She paused. "I just want the kid to go." Nora picked up the bill and held it for a moment. She folded it and gave it back to Emma. "You take it to the school secretary. Tell her it's for the field trip fund. Don't say anything else." Emma took the bill and left the study, and Nora heard the front door open and close. And she sat at her desk and looked at the window for a while and thought about the specific forms that education took when it came from inside a life rather than from outside it. Emma came home 20 minutes later and said the secretary had said thank you, and that was all. She put her backpack down and took out her homework, and that was the end of it, which was exactly the right amount of end for what it had been. The Cosmosphere had a standing program for schools groups, and Nora called them in June and made a donation that would cover reduced cost admission for 20 school groups per year for 5 years. She did not tell Emma she had done this. Emma found out 3 months later when a thank you letter arrived addressed to the Callahan Family Foundation, and she read it at the kitchen table and looked at her mother without saying anything. Then she went back to reading the letter. After a moment, she said, 20 groups a year, for 5 years. Emma folded the letter and put it in the foundation file she kept in her room, which she had organized with the same methodical care she brought to her homework. Good, she says. Dale Hutchins closed out the security contract in July, the month after Nora had gone back to the bunker alone. He came to the house to do it, which was not strictly necessary, and Nora understood when he arrived that he had come not for the paperwork, but to complete something in the way that certain people needed to complete things when they had been part of something they considered worth finishing properly. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and said he had been doing private security for 9 years, and this had been an unusual case in several respects. Nora asked him which respects. He said most of his cases involved people protecting what they already had. This one had been different. He had been protecting something whose nature was still being determined, whose legal status was being established, while the physical reality of it sat in a concrete room in rural Kansas, waiting for the outcome. He said he had told his wife about it the first week, and it sounded like a fable. What did you tell her? Nora asked. I told her fables didn't usually involve federal declaratory judgment filings. Emma, who was doing homework at the other end of the table, said without looking up, real things are usually more complicated than fables. Dale looked at her and then at Nora. How old is she? 9. 9, he said, as if filing this for future reference. He finished his coffee and signed the closing paperwork and shook Nora's hand at the door and said, with the brevity of someone who did not produce compliments for social reasons, that it had been a privilege. After he left, Emma looked up from her homework. He meant that, I know. People don't usually mean it when they say privilege. He's the kind of person who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. Nora started washing the coffee cups. There are more of those than you'd think. The Operation Cold Harbor proceeding concluded in September. Patricia had negotiated the final terms with the National Archives Office over 3 months, and the resolution had been, by any measure, more favorable than the preliminary offer that had been polite fiction. The $4 million cooperation fee had been confirmed. Additionally, Nora had secured an agreement that the documentation would be processed through independent historical review before any government summary was released, which meant that whatever the record contained would be described by historians rather than by the same institution whose internal communications it documented. The chief archivist had called Nora directly after the agreement was signed, which Patricia said was unusual, and had spoken for several minutes about the significance of the find. She said that the DRA program had been known to Cold War historians in outline, but that its internal records had been considered permanently lost, categorized in the literature as a gap in the archival record that could not be filled. The Operation Cold Harbor documentation covered 10 years of communications between senior defense officials and the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, and several major financial institutions, describing in granular detail the financial architecture of Cold War emergency preparedness planning. It would change several things that historians believed they understood about that period. Nora had listened and then asked one question. Had anyone been looking for the installation? The archivist said no. The program had been classified at a level that kept it out of the standard declassification review processes, and the dissolution of the agency in 1973 had effectively removed it from the institutional memory of any surviving organization. No one had been looking because no one had known there was anything to look for. 51 years. Sealed room. Nobody looking. Nora thought about this after the call. She thought about the county auction listing. Sealed concrete structure, former government designation, condition unknown. Bureaucratic language of something nobody knew what to do with. She thought about the 11 years the county had been sitting on a parcel before putting it in the auction, and the years before that when it had been accumulating tax delinquency, the whole long accumulation of institutional indifference that had brought the listing into existence and put it in front of her on a library printer for 8 cents. She had not been the intended recipient of any of it. There had been no intention. That was the whole point. The intention had ended with Harold Mears in September 1973, and what had replaced it was the absence of intention, the slow drift of an abandoned program through bureaucratic time, until it arrived at a county auction where a woman with $412 raised her hand because it was all she could afford. She thought about this occasionally in the months that followed, and could not locate in it anything that felt like fate, which she was not sure she believed in, or luck, which she believed in too much to use as an explanation. Felt, when she sat with it honestly, like the specific result of paying attention when the thing in front of you looked like nothing, of looking at sealed concrete structure, condition unknown, and wondering what was in it rather than accepting the implied answer that the answer was nothing. She had paid 8 cents to print the listing. She had spent $400 to own it. She had spent $63 at the hardware store. She had borrowed a crowbar from her sister's garage. She had stood in a cold room with a work light and kept her hands steady and looked at what was there rather than at what she expected to see. If the rest of it had followed from that, which was not the same as saying the rest of it had been easy or inevitable or that anyone could have done it. It was saying that attention, sustained and honest and undeflected by what other people's assessments said the thing was worth, had been the beginning of everything. She wrote this down in the notebook she had started keeping in January, not a journal exactly, more a record of things she wanted to remember the way she had actually experienced them, rather than the way they would be simplified when enough time had passed. She wrote it plainly and did not try to make it more or less than what it was. Emma found the notebook on the desk in May and asked if she could read it. Nora said yes. Emma sat in the study chair and read it in the unhurried way she read everything, and when she finished, she put it back on the desk exactly as she had found it. You should keep writing it, she said. I mean longer. There's more to say. Nora looked at her. What would you add? Emma thought about this. Backpack thing. How, when we were buying backpacks, I kept thinking about the one with the broken zipper and how the boy held it shut with his hand. How that was the thing that made it real. She paused. Details like that, the small ones. Those are the ones that are true. Nora wrote it down that night. The broken zipper. The hand holding it shut. The boy putting Emma's supply kit inside and closing the zipper by hand again, because the zipper was broken, and that was how he carried things, and Emma watching this without sentiment, just observation, and then saying, "We need to buy backpacks, the small ones, the ones that are true." The Foundation's first full year of operation placed 47 families. The number was smaller than Nora had hoped, and larger than the program director, a woman named Sandra Tills, who had spent 12 years in social services before joining, had predicted for a first year operating from scratch with new systems. Sandra ran things with a pragmatism that came from knowing exactly how slowly institutional processes moved and exactly where to push to make them move faster. And she and Nora had spent the first 3 months learning each other's working styles and arriving at a productive equilibrium that Emma, who sat in on board meetings with the attentiveness of someone taking a long course, described as good friction. Diane managed the financial operations with the organized intensity she brought to everything she decided mattered. She had taken a leave from her previous work in the fall and had not discussed returning to it, and Nora had not raised the subject. And the implicit understanding between them was that this was where Diane had decided to be, and the conversation about it had already happened in the kitchen in November when Diane had said, "Tell me what you need," and Nora had said, "I want you on it." Mark had stayed on as general counsel, a role he had not occupied for a client before, but which he adapted to without apparent difficulty. He said once, in the margins of a board meeting when the agenda had run long, he had gone to law school because he had believed the law could do what it was supposed to do when the right people handled it correctly, and that he had spent 20 years handling property disputes in Wichita, and had found this belief tested more often than he preferred, and that this case had been the best argument for the original belief that he had encountered in his professional life. Patricia Okafor called twice a year with the specific efficiency of someone whose time was genuinely scarce. She asked after Emma. She said Emma should consider law school. Nora said Emma was 10 and had some time. Patricia said 10 was when you started thinking about it. Nora said she would pass that along. Emma, when told, said she was considering several things and would update her position as information became available, which Nora passed back to Patricia, who said she definitely should go to law school. The bunker itself, Nora had decided, after several months of thinking about it, not to demolish and not to sell. She had the property fenced properly and the structure secured with permanent systems, and she paid the property taxes on it, which were not large, and she left it. She was not entirely sure why. It was not sentiment exactly, or not only that. It was something closer to the understanding that the room had existed for 51 years waiting, and that the waiting had meant something, and that erasing the room would be erasing the record of the waiting, and she was not ready to do that. She drove out to it 3 or 4 times a year, not to go in, just to park on the gravel apron and look at the exterior and let the ordinary reality of it do whatever it did when she was in front of it. Emma came with her sometimes and sometimes did not, and when she did not, she said, with the directness she used for most things, "I remember it well enough. I don't need to look at it," which was probably true. Emma remembered things with the precision of someone who understood that memory was a practice and not just a capacity, that you kept things by paying attention to them rather than by simply having been present when they happened. October, 14 months after the auction, Nora drove to the Pratt County Courthouse, not for any official reason. Case was concluded. The deed was long since transferred. There was no errand that required her presence. She drove there because she wanted to stand in the room where it had started, which she had not done since the morning of the auction itself. Basement room was the same. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, the smell of old carpet and institutional time. Auctioneer's podium at the front. She stood in the doorway and looked at the chair where she had sat, and the space at the front where Garrett had stood with his too large voice, and the moment at 9:47 when she had raised her hand, and the room had not reacted because there was nothing to react to, just a woman raising her hand for something nobody else wanted. She stood there for a while. County employee came through with a stack of folders and gave her a brief look of professional incuriosity and continued through the room without stopping. She thought about what it would look like from the outside. A woman standing in the doorway of an empty auction room, looking at nothing in particular on a Tuesday morning in October. Nothing about it would indicate what had happened in this room or what the interval between that morning and this one had contained. That was fine. Most of what mattered didn't announce itself. Most of the real things happened in ordinary rooms that looked like nothing, in choices that looked small, in moments that were invisible to everyone except the person inside them. She drove home. Emma was at the kitchen table with Dollar's head in her lap, reading a book about soil composition that she had checked out from the school library without any apparent assigned reason for doing so, which was how Emma read most things. She looked up when Nora came in. The courthouse? Yeah. Emma looked at her for a moment with the clear, direct attention she used when she was checking something rather than asking a question. Then she looked back at her book. Yeah. Dollar relocated his head to a more optimal position, and Emma moved to accommodate him without looking up from the page. Nora stood in the kitchen of her house and looked at her daughter and her dog and the afternoon light coming through the window and felt the thing she had been feeling in various intensities since the ruling, which was not quite relief because relief implied an ending. And this was not an ending, and was not quite happiness, because happiness was too simple a word for something that had so much weight to it. All the accumulated weight of everything that had preceded it was more like the feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be, which she had not felt in a long time, which she had been afraid she might not feel again, which she now understood was available to anyone who stayed present in their own life, long enough to recognize it when it arrived. She put her bag down. She started making dinner. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the October wind, their leaves gone gold now, the particular gold of Kansas in fall that had no analog anywhere she had ever been. Emma turned a page. See. Dollar sighed with the comprehensive satisfaction of a creature who had assessed the situation and found it adequate. Nora cooked and thought about nothing in particular, and that was enough. That was, she had come to understand, the whole point. Not the gold, not the number, not the foundation or the court ruling, or the 4 months of sustained alertness, or the moment the door swung inward on its rusted hinges, and the clean, cold air came out, and her work light opened across the floor. A kitchen in the late afternoon, a daughter reading about soil, dog who had cost $35 being comprehensively himself. The long light through the window of a house they had found together. The ordinary, irreplaceable weight of being home. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.